Hello, and welcome to today's lecture on the Peloponnesian War. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we are going to see how the Golden Age of Athens falls apart very, very quickly. And that, of course, is with the Peloponnesian War, the struggle between the Athenians and the Spartans. So we're going to start by setting the scene, figuring out how we got to this point. From there, we're going to go through the 3 steps of the Peloponnesian War, starting with the Archidamian War, 431 to 421, the Peace of Nicias, and the Sicilian Expedition, and that goes from 420 to 413, and then finally the Ionian War from 412 until the end of the conflict in 404 BC, and finally we'll wrap up with a few concluding thoughts. So, how do we get to this massive battle between the Athenians and the Spartans? Well, of course, it starts all the way back around 3000 BC with the dawn of the Bronze Age. That period for 1800 years, we see the rise of complexity in things like monumental architecture, political hierarchies, artistic achievements, writing, all these things, which comes to a conclusion in the Dark Age where we see the collapse of all those things. No more monumental architecture, no more writing, much poorer burials, much less sophisticated art and architecture. And that turns around in the 8th century BC, where we see the rise of the Archaic period in Greece and the beginnings of what we start to associate with kind of Greek culture. Things like iconographic, life-size and monumental sculpture, monumental architecture, writing, literature, those sorts of technologies, things like drama, that sort of thing. And what we see at the very, very end of the Archaic period is that we see the Greeks win a series of unexpected victories. First over the Persians at the Battle of Salamis. Remember, the Greeks had just lost Thermopylae. Things were looking really, really bad. The city of Athens had been burned, and yet the Greeks are able to bait the Persians into a rather, let's say, not that intelligent naval battle from the Persian perspective at the site of Salamis, where the Greeks decimate the Persian fleet. And without that fleet, the Persians can no longer support their infantry. And so eventually the Greeks are able to kick those Persians back out of mainland Greece. And at the same time that's happening in Greece, the Sicilian Greeks, led by Theron of Acragas and Gilon of Syracuse, are able to defeat Hamilcar I of Carthage at the Battle of Himera, establishing Greek dominance over the island of Sicily. So that's all well and good. Those victories usher in what we call the Classical Age, or the Golden Age, of Greece, starting in 480. And we see things like classical Greek philosophy, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. We see classical Greek sculpture, right, with this fluidity and realism and idealism built into it. We see things like monumental classical Greek architecture, best exemplified by the Parthenon. And we see Greek drama, right? People being able to express their concerns about government, right? Really have a freedom of speech with things like the comedies of the ancient Greek world. But even all these kind of wonderful things are happening, we still have this tension in large part because the Athenians are still a little bit scared of the Sicilians and how wealthy the Sicilian Greeks are getting. And the Spartans are a little bit scared of the Athenians and how kind of wealthy the Athenians are getting. And so despite all these wonderful achievements, we still get this kind of very high level of tension as we move towards the latter half of the 5th century BC. So let's take a look at the edge of the abyss. So we see that in the aftermath of the Persian Wars, the Athenians control this fleet, and they're using that for 2 purposes. One is that they're distributing grain all around the Aegean Sea, and they're getting really rich from selling grain. The other thing that they're doing is that they're basically charging everybody a protection tax. They're saying, we will protect you if you pay us money. We're going to protect you from the Persians. And so they found this thing called the Delian League, and they get very, very wealthy from this protection tax. Now we see in 449, through this peace of CLAS, that what the Athenians do is they're able to broker a peace with the Persians. And even though this sounds like a great idea, it actually has some unintended consequences. The major one being that these city-states that were paying a tax to the Athenians for protection are basically like, why should we pay a protection tax if the war's over? And so they all start revolting. all these different regions revolt. Things are looking pretty bad for Athens until Pericles, the Athenian leader, steps in, squashes the rebellions, and brokers a peace with the Spartans, who had kind of had eyes on taking over Athens militarily. So he signs the 30 Years' Peace, and during the next decade or so, he's able to put down these revolts and start generating revenues for Athens once again. What we start to get in the 430s BC is we start to get a series of conflicts that's threatening this 30 Years' Peace. And those conflicts start between Athens and Corinth. And remember that Athens was really trying to build this alliance with Corinth to pull Corinth away from kind of a Spartan alliance, but Corinth never really goes over to the Athenian side. And so Athens fights with Corinth at the site of Corcyra, and then that happens again the following year at the site of Potidaea. And then eventually, the straw that breaks the camel's back is that Athens tries to starve a group called the Megarians, right? People from Megara. And Megara had been associated and allied with the Spartans, and what the Athenians do is they block all Athenian harbors from Megarians. And so the Megarians can't get food, they're starving, and that's when Sparta steps in. And when Sparta steps in 431, we see what we call the beginnings of the Peloponnesian War. And this is what kind of the Spartans' perspective was. This was kind of the Athenian take on why the Spartans started this fight. So it says the Spartans voted that the treaty had been broken, and that's because of the blockade on Megara. And that war should be declared not so much because they were influenced by speeches of their allies, but because they were afraid of further increase of Athenian power, seeing as they did that already the greater part of Greece was under control of Athens. So Thucydides, an Athenian soldier, he says that the Spartans are doing this because they don't want to see Athens gain any more power. Now, the war is broken into essentially three different parts. And the first part is known as the Archidamian War. So beginning in 431 BC, what Sparta does is they march up through the Peloponnese and they basically lay siege to the city of Athens. Now, not really lay siege to it in the sense that they have siege engines and are trying to break down the walls, but really what they're trying to do is starve the Athenians out and get the Athenians to come out and actually fight them on land. Now, the Athenians are a smart group of people, and they realize that the Spartans have a way better army than they do, and so they are not going to fight. Now, if you're looking at the dates for this, right, 10 years is a long time for a siege. And you might be wondering, how does Athens actually feed itself for 10 years if they can't leave the city? And that's actually, the way that they do this is this brilliant invention they call the long walls. It's a series of like 9 or 10 mile long walls, two of them built from the walled city of Athens all the way to the harbor of Piraeus. And then Piraeus itself is also encircled in walls. And so they can walk through, right, and be protected like 10 miles from the city to the port. And because they still have control of the fleet, they can still bring grain into the city by sailing it into the harbor at Piraeus, marching it through the long walls into the city of Athens. So we also want to look, when we're talking about the Peloponnesian War, we think of Athens versus Sparta, but we also want to keep in mind that there are major alliances on both sides. So it's Athens and the remnants of a lot of the Delian League, Ionia over here, northern Greece, Attica and Euboea, versus the Spartans. And remember, the Spartans had this Peloponnesian League with cities like Corinth. So what happens after this 10-year-long siege where nothing really occurs? It's kind of a war of attrition. Well, in 421, Nicias or Nicias is able to broker a peace. He's an Athenian guy. He's able to broker a peace with the Spartans that he says is going to have a 10-year truce. Okay? And so it's this kind of short temporary truce, and that allows Athens to actually kind of get some food once again. It allows Sparta to kind of go back home without having to stay out there in the field for so long. And during this time, during this peace, we see the rise of a really unique Athenian politician. And his name is Alcibiades, and we'll talk more about him. but he's kind of this very flamboyant, very captivating Athenian politician who's actually also a little bit crazy. And immediately when he takes over, he starts trying to broker all these alliances with city-states that used to be loyal to Sparta. So he's able to get like Argos and these other Peloponnesian cities to come over to the Athenian side. Now, that actually might have been a good idea, but then Alcibiades starts having these crazy ideas. And what he starts convincing the Athenians of is the way to win this war decisively is to take over the island of Sicily. So let's look at where we are, right? This is the Greek homeland. Here's the Aegean, Ionia, the Peloponnese, Athens, and Attica over here. And what Alcibiades is saying, right, is in order to win this war, we need to get over here and take over that whole island. This is going to turn out to be a terrible idea. Now, Alcibiades is such a charismatic guy that he's able to convince the Athenians this is indeed what they need to do. And they get ready to mount this expedition. The night before they set sail, Alcibiades and his friends get really drunk at a symposium and go around the city chopping off the phalluses, or the phalloi, of what we call these Herms. All right, so these Herms are statues of Hermes that represent, let's say, his head and his other head. And they're put around the city, and they are kind of used to facilitate wealth and protection for different families that live in houses. So you'd put these along the street to keep wealth and protection for the people in the city. And Alcibiades goes around chopping off the phalluses of all of these Herms the night before they're supposed to leave on the Sicilian expedition. And this is a terrible omen for the Greeks. And they want to put him on trial, but then he sails away to Sicily anyway. And the Greeks embark on this expedition, or the Athenians embark upon this expedition with very, very bad omens. So, no more phalluses for the Herms in Athens. And so we see the Athenian fleet sail from Athens around the Mediterranean, right around the Peloponnese, through the boot of Italy, and eventually down to the island of Sicily. And once they reach Sicily, they end up talking to one of the native groups there. So remember we saw all the Greeks along the coast and the Carthaginians along the other coast, but there are also these native Sicilian tribes. So we get the Siciloi over here in the east, the Sicanoi in the center, and the Elymians, or the Elymoi, over on the western part of the island. And the Elymians are actually adopting quite a bit of Greek culture. So we can see that they actually build themselves a Greek temple at the site of Segesta. It's one of the best preserved Doric temples in the entire Greek world, and we think it was built by native Elymians. Now what the Elymians do is they end up talking to the Athenians, and they're trying to team up with the Athenians because they want the Greek city-states over here to stop bothering them. So the Syracusans and the people from Achragos and the people from Silenus, they're always butting into Elymian territory, and the Elymians want them out. And so what they do is they bring Athens over, and they say, why don't you help us, right? We're super, super wealthy. And what you want to do is just take over the whole island, Athens, and then kind of leave us in charge, and let's just show you how wealthy we are. And so the Athenians go into one house, and the Elymians lay out all this gold and treasure. And then as the Athenians walk to the next house, the Elymians gather up that just one thing of gold and treasure they have, move it to the next house, and show it all to the Athenians again. And that happens over and over and over. And the Athenians are going around thinking that the Elymians are so wealthy that it's a great idea to take over the island. And the Elymians, of course, just have a small amount of treasure that they keep moving from house to house to house to fool the Athenians. But it ends up working, and in the end, the Athenians are convinced they got to take over Syracuse in order to take over the island of Sicily. And so what we end up seeing is the siege of Syracuse begun in 415 BC. And this is a travesty for the Athenians. What they end up trying to do is they end up trying to basically starve Syracuse. So they have a naval blockade outside of the city, and then what they do is they send troops in to build a wall on the inside of the city, thereby trapping them at sea and on land in this small little territory where they can't possibly feed themselves. But what the Syracusans do, they know the land really well. They end up building what we call these counter walls. And so the Athenians are trying to build this series of walls here to block them in. The Syracusans build a series of counter walls here that basically block the walls that the Athenians are trying to make. And once those walls are blocked and the Syracusans can actually get enough food, then they end up fighting the Athenians both on sea and on land, and the Syracusans dominate them big time. The Athenian fleet is essentially destroyed. The Athenian infantry is cut in half. Maybe they lose more than half of their infantry. But this is basically the downfall of Athens in the Peloponnesian War, right in the middle of it. Things are looking really, really grim. Athens has been decimated. And this brings us to the third phase of the war, what we call the Ionian War, because much of this is happening on that west coast of Turkey, the region we call Ionia. So the defeat over in Sicily kind of ushers in what we could think of as Athens' darkest hour, starting around 412 BC. And what we end up seeing is that it gets so bad that they disband the democracy. All right? So democracy is out. They put in an oligarchy. That guy Alcibiades, earlier on, right, after he went to Sicily, and then he went back to go on trial for chopping off the phalluses of the Herms, he's going to be put to death. He abandons Athens and he goes down to Sparta. And he just gives them all the Athenian secrets for a while. But things are so bad right now that Athens recalls Alcibiades and says, come back, we need you. So they bring back this crazy dude. At the same time this is happening in Athens, where things do not look good, down in Sparta, they're teaming up with Persia. And they're getting so much money from this that Sparta's building like a huge fleet. And so Spartans now have a fleet that's actually bigger than the Athenians, and their land army has always been better than the Athenians, and so things are really not looking good for Athens. And so again, just to kind of situate what's going on, this is Ionia over here on the west coast of Turkey. We see Athens teamed up with groups from Attica, Euboea, Thessaly up here, and we see the Spartans teamed up with the Peloponnesian League and city-states like Thebes. Now, the Athenians are desperate. The Spartans, using Persian money, now have a huge fleet. They also have a way better infantry with the Spartans that are renowned for warfare. So what is Athens going to do? Well, Athens ends up trying to rebuild their own fleet. They don't have any money. So what they end up doing is they go into their most sacred temples. And what they do is they take the cult statues. This is a recreation of the cult statue of Athena Parthenos from the Parthenon in gold, in ivory, and they melt those statues down. They melt all their gods. They literally melt their gods down and use the gold and bronze from those statues to purchase a new set of 110 ships. So Athens melts their gods and rebuilds their fleet. And from there, they sail to Arginusae over on the Ionian coast. And in 406 BC, Athens is miraculously able to defeat the Spartan fleet at the Battle of Arginusae, to the point where Sparta is begging for peace at the end. They're saying, let's sign a treaty. Let's end the Peloponnesian War. You win, Athens. Now, Athens, you'd think, after having it so bad for so long, would gladly accept an end of the war. They stupidly, stupidly do not. So they say, no, Sparta, we are going to destroy you once and for all. And 2 years later, at the Battle of Aegospotami, Athens realizes its mistake. So what Sparta has done is they've gone up here to a region that we call the Hellespont, all right? And that's a really important region because it's the entryway into the Black Sea up here. And that's a place where they're growing a lot of their grain. And so the Spartans are blocking the grain from the Black Sea from making it down through here to Athens, essentially trying to starve Athens. So Athens has got to send out its fleet, recently victorious at the Battle of Arginusae, and they send up, but they can't really find a good place to moor their ships. And they could do it far away, like 12 miles from where the Spartans are. But what they do is they decide, no, we need to get closer. And so they go to a place called Aegospotami, not a good place for ships, not a good place for troops. And essentially the Spartans kind of lock them in there. And after days and days, the Athenian army is starving. And eventually they just can't take it anymore and they go out and they're looking for food, right? And while they're out looking for food, the Spartan army descends on the Athenians and destroys them. And this is it. This is the end of the Peloponnesian War. The Spartans slaughter the Athenians while the Athenians are out looking for food. And now the Athenians actually have to make peace with the Spartans. And that doesn't go so well for the Athenians. So the first thing the Spartans want is essentially all the Athenian ships. And so the Spartans take like 170 Athenian ships. They leave Athens 12 ships. They also get rid of the Athenian government, right? Remember, it was democracy for a long time, then it was this oligarchy. They kick all those guys out, and they install 30 tyrants of their own choosing to govern the city of Athens. Remember those long walls, the things that allowed the Athenian population to eat while the city was being besieged. Those are all destroyed. And then on top of that, right, a huge financial sum is due to the Spartans, along with the fact that Athens has to become an official ally of the city of Sparta. So, a few concluding thoughts. All right, and so what we see is we see the Golden Age of Athens is relatively short. And the reason for that is that the Athenian kind of power has bred fear, right? So we get Sparta kind of jealous of Athens, and they're jealous because of how much money Athens is raking in with this Delian League, right? Charging this kind of protection tax with the fleet that Athens has. Now, after a long drawn out war, with Athens being besieged but being able to eat because of the long walls, and then this peace that is then broken as Athens sails to Sicily to try to conquer it, a terrible mistake. But even with all those mistakes, Athens wins a huge victory at the Battle of Arginusae. Sparta sues for peace, and Athens says, no, we're destroying you once and for all. They do not destroy Sparta once and for all, and 2 years later at the Battle of Aegospotami, as the Athenian soldiers are out looking for food, the Spartan army comes in, slaughters them, and then Athens is forced to submit to really bad surrender terms. And so with that, this kind of golden age comes to an end. The Golden Age of Athens comes to an end with the Spartan victory in the Peloponnesian War.